Eric, here comes the question of all the questions for tonight.
Okay.
When I was a newcomer to the United States, I heard about this documentary called The Zeitgeist that was extremely popular back
Oh
in the
no,
days.
I've never actually watched Zeitgeist, but I know enough about it. Go ahead.
Yeah, when I watched it, I mean, it's not just religious; it was also political and stuff like that, which are really not something that interests me.
Yeah,
But in that documentary, a portion was dedicated to prove that Jesus was just a copycat of earlier dying and rising mythological saviors and divine figures, and that even if Jesus did exist, he surely wasn't divine. But if we would compare the stories coming from pagan literature, we see that there are many figures supposedly coming before Jesus through the virgin birth, having 12 disciples, being killed, resurrected, and so
yeah,
on and so on. And again, like an hour ago, I mentioned that when I was an early Christian, and some other things bugged me, and they were making me, almost not lose my faith, but cause a lot of doubt. So this was another big point of my life when, until I found answers, it caused me seriously doubting and being anxious about my faith until I dig more and bought books, listen to YouTube videos. But you can take as much time as you have. Please tell us, is Jesus just a copycat of earlier mythological divine figures?
well, yeah. I mean, to me, this is one of the most silly objections, and I'm kind of surprised that it seems to, after I thought it was dead, seems to be resurfacing again by people who really should know better, who are popularizers on the internet. And I I think it's silly in a number of different ways, but in a way, I'll give it some credit. This is kind of what C.S. Lewis was a hang up for him. He said that when he was an atheist, he wrote a letter that says, "Often great men are regarded as gods after their death, such as Hercules and Odin. So after the death of a Hebrew philosopher named Yeshua, whose name we've now corrupted into Jesus, he was seen as a god, leading to the rise of the cult connected to the ancient Hebrew Yahweh worship, thus giving birth to Christianity, one mythology among many, but one that we happen to be brought up in." Well, C.S. Lewis later actually read the Gospels, and had some interesting conversations with his friend Tolkien at Oxford. Later, in an essay called Fern Seeds and Elephants, he says that I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they're like. I know not one of them is like this. Of this text, there are either two possible explanations. Either this is reportage, though it may no doubt contain some errors, pretty close to the facts, nearly as close as Boswell, or else some unknown writer in the second century without any known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. If it is untrue, it must be a narrative of that kind. The reader who doesn't see this simply has not learned to read. And so Lewis is not pulling any punches. He's just basically like, you have absolutely zero reading comprehension skills if you can't see that. When it comes to looking at the parallels, obviously Zeitgeist is like the lowest of low hanging fruit. The parallels are bad, like um, Mithras was born of a rock, not a virgin, and stuff like that. You could go on and on and on. Most of the time when you look at these parallels, they're very disinteresting. Like they're bad parallels. There's not a really clear connection at all. Second of all, as I said earlier, and just as from reading the quote from Lewis, this is reportage. This is historical narrative. That Luke is saying that he's reporting historical narrative. John is saying that I'm a witness to these things. They're claiming to be witnesses. Okay, they involve real people. We have Caiaphas's ossuary, for crying out loud. I mean, we have the Pilate stone. We know these people actually existed. We know Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate because we read about it in Tacitus. And so it's silly. It's nonsense. It's ridiculous. It doesn't understand the genre of the Gospels. It doesn't have any appreciation of the historical details in the Gospels. And yeah, it's just I don't. You look at the actual parallels that these people offer. Most of the time, it's pretty spurious. But let's just say that there are some half decent parallels, some decent parallels. Some scholars say, well, the Gospels, they're not copying pagan myths, but maybe they're copying Jewish stories. Like we talked about the feeding of the 5,000. Well, maybe that Elisha fed 100 people with a handful of bread. Maybe the gospel writers are just saying that he's cooler than the prophet Elisha. Well, if God is the author of the story, why can't he choose to parallel something if he wanted to? How can you rule that out? How can you, right? If God is creating a story and he wants it to appeal to Jews and pagans, then he can make a story if he wanted to that's going to stick out to Jews and pagans. The parallels that people are choking on are often miracles. Bacchus supposedly turned water into wine. Well, no, he didn't. He had wine miracles, but he never turned water into wine. But what if God just decided, you know what, I'm a troll Bacchus. Jesus is cooler because I decided to, and it's not just actual invention, right? Parallels by themselves don't tell you anything. That's a post hoc fallacy. Just because something came before, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's derived from that. You actually have to show a connection. And even if there was a connection, you have to talk about what kind of literature this is. And you can't rule out that God might be being like, I'm going to one up this particular story, right? You guys have weird birth narratives. Well, bam, virgin birth. I don't care. You know what I mean? And so you're going to say Romulus ascended into heaven? Well, guess what? So did Jesus, whatever. And so if God is an agent and he wants to do these things to create a story that appeals to these people, you can't rule that out. And so what you have to do is you have to say, okay, when did these reports actually come out? Were they reports made by witnesses, or are they just legends that were made up long, long ago, way after the events, far, far away in fantasy land? And were these events that were initially reported, were they something that were just like widely received among people, or did they actually have some resistance to them and then have to, was there a context of persecution in bringing forward these stories? And you have to look at different things like that. And there's obviously no clear motives. And so, because if God is going to work a miracle, it's going to have this air of mythicalness to us. It just is, right? Just because like Asclepius supposedly healed people. Well, if Jesus heals people, of course, like it's going to sound like Asclepius because Asclepius supposedly miraculously healed people, right? Asclepius opened the eyes of the blind. Well, big. I guess Jesus can't do blind eyes. All right. I guess that's off limits because you don't want to get accused of borrowing from the myths of Asclepius. Give me a break. Like, what exactly is God supposed to do? If there's all these myths and legends about all these different kind of miracles, like, what does he do? Well, Romulus ascended into heaven. So I guess, Jesus, you're not allowed to do that. You got to, shrink down like Ant-Man and, disappear into the quantum realm. Be original. Come on, don't, if who did I say? Bacchus turned water into wine, or Dionysus, whatever. I think they're the same guy. Well, you can't have any wine miracles because they already did that. It's just like, what is he supposed to do? Like turn the water into Baja Blast Mountain Dew at the wedding? Like, really impress people? Do something that's way technologically advanced? I don't know. Maybe it sounds silly what I'm saying here, but because this whole stuff is silly. Parallels mean nothing. They don't mean anything against historicity. You have to actually look at the documents to determine historicity. And you can't rule out that God exists if he just wanted to parallel, even granting all their points, even granting that they look exactly alike, which they don't. If you look at them again, they're pretty spurious. That doesn't. So what? The Titanic. There is a fictional story, the sinking of the Titan, that happened.
I was about to mention this. Thank you.
20 years before the Titanic. It talks about people hitting an iceberg in the Atlantic in a big ocean cruise liner, and it looks exactly the same. And people still think, "What are you, like Nostradamus or something, dude?" Like people were suspicious over this guy. There's all those parallels between Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy that are really spooky. Like, people find patterns and see parallels in all kinds of things. That doesn't mean anything, you know. Like I could pick out parallels between Alexander the Great and Napoleon if I wanted to. So what? Like that doesn't mean that there's no historicity. So, anyways, that was a soapbox. I probably answered that longer than I needed to, but yeah, parallels mean diddly squat. They can count as some evidence against historicity, but you have to look at everything. You have to look at the entire picture. You can't just look and say parallel, therefore fiction. You have to look at all of the evidence that's on the table.
Hey, thank you so much for that. I just want to mention, for example, when I was struggling with this, one of the people who helped me, well, not him personally, but his YouTube channel was Michael Jones,
Mm-hmm.
and his Inspiring Philosophy channel. He would dedicate each video to another deity, including Dionysus, which whom you mentioned, and he would be like, "Hey, is it true what atheists are claiming that this figure?" Is resembling Jesus. Well, actually, let's go to the original text, and he would dissect everything. And it turned out, in most of these, if not all of these cases, there
Yeah.
like maybe one or two resemblances, and that's it. Everything else was just exaggerated.